Hello everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. Welcome back. And if you are new, thanks so much for checking out my channel. Please hit subscribe and stick around. Today I am going to be talking about the books that I read in July. And I'm also going to tell you if any of these books have Rizz. If you don't know what Rizz is, it is a newer term that means charisma or charismatic. Rizz, see? You may have seen this on Shorts or TikTok. All the cool kids are using it. So I am going to tell you about the 6 books that I read in July and then talk about their Rizz factor. I'm going to start with a book that I actually asked all of you to vote for on my community tab. And I asked which book I should read next, and I gave 2 options. One was Say You're One of Them, which is by Uwem Akpan. I think that's the last name. And the other was Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. And the poll received 28 votes, and 82% of them were for Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. So you have good taste, since this is one of the authors on the Booker long list. And I've put out a second poll, and the results were another Booker longlist author. So all of you are on a roll. So back to Stay With Me. This is Adebayo's debut novel, and it's set in Nigeria. We meet Yejide and Akin, who in some ways have an unconventional marriage for Nigeria. First, Yejide is Akin's only wife, and they still haven't had a child. So this is where things get interesting. One day, Akin and Yejide's family show up and introduce Yejide to Akin's newest wife. The hope is that she will be able to give Akin a child. As you can imagine, there is a lot of tension between Yejide and Akin, between Yejide and the new wife, and this is where it gets really interesting. Yejide eventually announces that she is pregnant. This is cause for great celebration, and Yejide hopes this will save her marriage. But what happens when Yejide is still pregnant 10 months later? Oh yes, it gets very interesting. So the elements that make this book Rizz is the language. It has beautiful writing, also the concept and how it conveys the pressure of having children and the feelings that couples have when they can't conceive. There's also themes of, marriage and miscarriage. The book starts off stronger than it ended, which is kind of, what stopped me from giving it 5 stars. But this was still a really, really good book. And I'm now looking forward to reading more from this author, including the Booker longlist book. Next up is a memoir, From Scratch, a memoir of love, Sicily, and finding home by Tembi, Locke. This has been adapted to a film that is on Netflix, and I did watch it after reading the book. The subtitle, I think, should also include something about loss or grief, because that is a huge theme in this story. We know very early on in the book, this is not a spoiler, that Tembi's husband, Sabo, has died. The way the story is told is in some ways backwards. So we know he has died, but then Tembi kind of takes us to the beginning of their love story when Tembi, who is a Black actress from LA, goes to Florence, Italy to be in an art program. And while she's there, she meets Sabo, a white chef, and they have this immediate connection. And Tembi ends up staying longer in Italy, and the two fall in love, and they are determined to not let anything get in the way of that love, including Sabo's family, who very much disapprove of him marrying a Black American. So despite this, Tembi and Sabo move to LA, and similar to the last book, they want to start a family, but they are having trouble conceiving. So again, because the book starts at the end, we actually know that they have a daughter, and slowly this story is revealed about their daughter. So I did give this book 5 stars. So you know it must have had Rizz. So first, it tells their love story beautifully. It's sad and it makes you laugh. I love books that do that. There's all the feels in between. You probably won't be surprised, but I love the setting, especially just coming back from Italy in May. The other thing that I really enjoyed about this book is the healing that takes place between Sabo and his family, and Tembi and Sabo's family. As I mentioned, I did watch the movie after I read it, and it stays very close to the book. There are some differences, especially when it comes to Sabo's family, but in essence, the whole story is still there. So if you are, looking for a memoir, some Italian vibes, and a beautiful love story, then this is a good one to check out. The next book has also been adapted to film, and I'm going to say something that I rarely say, but this is one of those rare occasions where I enjoyed the movie more than the book. I know. I'm also surprised to be saying that this was probably my least favorite book of the month. I would have predicted this to be a 5-star read. And while I didn't hate the book by any means, I think I only gave it a 3 or 3.5 maybe, something like that. The book is Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistlestop Cafe by Fannie Flagg. In all fairness, I think this book had 2 things going against it for me. One was because of the book, and the other was because of me. So the book has very short chapters, and they give the dates and times before each chapter. The story is not told chronologically, and there are articles or newspaper headlines as well, and I just found that it jumped all over the place way too much. There's also quite a cast of characters, so in my opinion, I didn't spend any length of time with one character or group of characters before I was kind of whisked away, pulled away to another group of characters, and often at a completely different time. On my part, I never sat and just read a big chunk of it, and maybe that would have helped to make it feel less scattered all over the place. I think having watched the movie first, although it's been many years since I've seen it, I do think that it helped me because I know there is an amazing story here, but on reading it, I felt it got lost. So this story has a lot going for it. I thought the Rizz would be that it's set in a small town, like less than 200 people, I think. It has strong female lead characters. It has a great cast of characters. These are all things that I love. But like I said, it just didn't come together for me at all, which was really disappointing. Also a heads up that because of where and when this story takes place, Alabama in the late 1920s, there is a lot of racism and prejudice and tension between Black and white people. And the language in the book is used to show that. So a number of nasty things are said, including the N-word. I do have the sequel to this sitting on my shelf. Perhaps I will get to that at some point, and I'm hoping that when I do, I will enjoy that more than this one. The next book I have is actually a poetry collection called Muster Points by Lucas Crawford. I had originally hoped to read this in June for Pride Month, but it didn't quite make it, so I read it in July. Lucas Crawford is a queer author or poet from Nova Scotia, so if you are into poetry and want to read poetry for the Reading Across Canada 2023 challenge, then this would work for August's prompt. Muster point is a term that I had never heard until I moved to Alberta a couple years ago. So for those of you who might also be new to what a muster point is, it is basically the place where people would gather safely in case of an emergency. So for instance, the school is on fire. So all staff and students would gather at designated areas called muster points that are safely away from the fire. It totally makes sense. I had just never heard of that term before. Okay, so let me know if this is a new term for you too, because I don't know if I'm the only one. Okay, so back to the poetry. So this collection is divided into 5 parts. The last part is titled Muster Points. But one of the things that I thought about while I was reading was that Lucas Crawford wrote these poems while he was at the Banff Center for the Arts, which is a lovely spot here. He ended up kind of being captive there because of the pandemic. Now, it's not a bad place to be isolated, I have to say, but still, it was a scary time, especially if you were, away from home and not knowing what was going to happen and where we would be in a week, 2 weeks. So I kind of think, and I don't know if Lucas Crawford would agree with me or not, but I kind of think of these poems and the Center for the Arts, where they were written, as being a muster point for Crawford. So the poems, some of them are about the pandemic, but most of them are about relationships and queer sex. So a heads up that the language is explicit. So if that's not your jam, if that's not your thing, then this collection may not be your thing. But I will also say that if you do read these and they make you feel uncomfortable or awkward, maybe just ask yourself why. I think poetry is really good at making us feel uncomfortable, and I think that that's a good thing. I wouldn't say that I was uncomfortable reading this. However, I will say that there were times where I was surprised at how forceful the language could be. And that's a good thing. I mean forceful in a good way here. It was definitely a good thing because it made me stop. So my favorite section was probably the second and even some of the third section. A lot of the imagery was food related. And I think the third part is titled something like Gastro Poems or Gastro Poetics. It's something like that. I can't find it right now. But so what was Rizz about this collection? I would say that there were many times throughout the collection that lines of the poems made me see things in new ways, and I love when poetry can do that. If you are up for some queer Canadian poetry, I would say add this to your list. I have 2 more books to share, both by Canadian authors, and this next one I think was my most favorite of the month because it had a high Rizz factor, and it is The High Mountains of Portugal by Yann Martel. I loved this book. You may know this author because of Life of Pi, which I also enjoyed. This book was an adventure. It is surprising, it's fun, witty, and unlike anything else I've read. This is also a story about grief and loss. And even though it was fun and witty, I found it also had a lot of depth to it. The story is told in 3 kind of stories that are interconnected, although you don't find that out or exactly how until the end, which is part of the genius of this book. The first part begins in Lisbon with Thomas, who has experienced 3 significant losses in a very short period of time. He loses his son, his father, and his lover. Thomas decides to turn his back on God and the world, and he does so by only walking backwards. Thomas then finds an old journal, which the priest who wrote the journal talked about a crucifix. Thomas becomes almost enchanted by this crucifix and feels compelled to find it. So his quest begins, and he goes into the mountains of Portugal, hence the title, in an automobile, which are so new at the time. Most people have never seen one. They don't know about them. They don't know how to drive one, including Thomas. So this ensues a lot of humor. So then the second story takes place about 30 years later with a pathologist whose wife is an Agatha Christie fan, for those of you who love Agatha Christie. The story brings up the idea of faith and reason, and the wife makes connections between the Christie novel that she's reading and the life of Jesus. The conversation had me wondering if this was now going to become this kind of crime novel, but when a visitor arrives, things take a surprising turn, and that begins the adventure of the pathologist. In the third story, we meet Peter Tovey, who is a Canadian politician. He has just lost his wife, and he's so overwhelmed with grief that the government actually sends Peter to a refuge for apes. And there Peter befriends one of the chimps, and this friendship will change his life and connect him to the other two stories in the most interesting ways. So the Rizz for me in this book was the way the story was told, the way the three characters were connected, and the way the book was both quite sad and also quite funny and entertaining. So the fact that it all felt believable, if you could suspend judgment on reality for a bit and just let the story kind of take you away, almost like a fairy tale. This book for me, although it was surprising, it had all the Rizz. I couldn't help but be captivated by it. The final book that I want to talk about is Reproduction by Ian Williams. Now, I have talked about Ian Williams many times on my channel, and I was so happy to finally get to this Giller Prize winning book. I was even more thrilled to be doing this as a buddy read with Lindy from Lindy's Magpie Reads. I will link her channel below. This, I would say, this is my second book of the month that had a lot of Rizz, but for very different reasons than Mantel's book. Probably whenever I have mentioned Ian Williams before, like on my channel, I have talked about how he intentionally uses structure. I had only read his poetry before, so this was so great to see how he did this in the novel. When this book was first published, I had the opportunity to see Ian Williams give a reading and talk about the book in the Toronto International Festival of Authors. That was before the Giller win. And he was on a panel with Emma Donoghue and Michael Christie, two other authors that I've talked about quite a bit. And I was so intrigued by how Ian Williams put this book together, and was impressed by how thoughtful he is in every aspect of his writing. So the title is Reproduction, and Ian Williams made the book reproduce itself. So it starts off with XX and XY, female and male chromosomes, with 23 chapters. We meet Felicia and Edgar. They are both visiting their mothers, who are sharing a hospital room. And this is kind of the meet cute, I guess you could call it. There are some interesting bits about motherhood and child-mother relationships. So then in the second part, the book reproduces, and you have 4 characters with 16 chapters. So 2, 4, 4, 16. In the third part, there are 256 segments, which is 16 by 16. Now, Ian Williams couldn't keep this going because it would be too big. So in the fourth part, Ian Williams gives the book cancer. One of the characters also has cancer. And just reading the book, you wouldn't necessarily know that this is what is happening, but in the book, you can see how Ian Williams uses font sizes to show the cancerous tumors. And what's even more incredible, I think, is that if you read just the cancer bits, then it is actually saying something as well. So I will leave links below in the description box of a couple of different videos where Ian Williams explains the structure and the book. So not only is the structure what makes this book so Rizz but it's also how Ian Williams tells the story and the messages that he is conveying. So Felicia is a young Black woman, and Edgar is a white man who is really not nice. He is not a nice guy at all. I wanted to schmuck him many times. Ian Williams does a great job at showing how different these characters are by not just their own personalities, but in how they care for their mothers and in cultures and how they misunderstand each other's culture. So once we have these foundational characters, the story moves ahead, I forget how many years, but quite a bit. And we are introduced to Army, Heather, Oliver, and we still have Felicia's perspective in this part. So this group of characters show different types of love and community. There's romantic love, parental love, friendship, neighborly love, and I would say even the absence or maybe abuse of love. I really appreciated how Ian Williams writes flawed characters, and the development of his characters can be very surprising. I can't say that I loved any of these characters, but I liked them well enough. I liked Felicia. I especially liked Army. But the real surprise for me was Oliver, who is the man that Felicia and Army rent their home from. So in the end, I liked him the most, and it was a pleasant surprise. So within all of this, there is a deeper message of family and what makes a family. The whole nature versus nurture conversation comes into play. And I think the best part is that it is funny. There are some very funny lines in this. So lots of Rizz with this book too, especially if you like a book that doesn't have conventional formatting. If you like themes of family and different kinds of love, then I would recommend this one to you. So those are the books that I finished in July. Please let me know if you have read any of these, and if so, what you liked or maybe didn't like. If you haven't read any of them, are there any that pique your interest, any that you would like to read? Also, let me know what books you read in July that you would say had Rizz, or basically, what are the books that you enjoyed the most? What captivated you? I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.